Well, there is much to discuss. Let's bring in our panel right now. Joining us from Miami is Remy Pierre. He is Senior Director for America's Market Intelligence and a research fellow with the University of Miami's European Union Center. Joining us by Skype from Florida is conservative commentator Dan Perkins. Brian Becker is the Executive Director of the Answer Coalition and the host of Loud and Clear on Radio Sputnik International. Brian is right here with me in the studio. And from Quebec City, John Curtin is the Director of the G7 Research Group. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And let's start in Quebec City in Canada with John. And John, many of Donald Trump's partners at this G7 summit are very angry. We've heard comments being made, especially that one made by the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, saying that he was insulted and that he found Donald Trump's tariffs imposed on Canada unacceptable. Donald Trump himself has raised the prospect that he may not sign the joint communique that is normally issued during these summits. So, was the summit, in a sense, doomed even before it started?
Oh, not at all. And President Trump was right. They all got along. And they didn't take very long at all. It happened as soon as they sat down face to face. And it's all been sweetness and smiles from what we've seen. The session on trade, which they've already been through, was thought to be the one where the big disagreements would come. People thought it might infect the rest of the summit, but it just didn't happen from what we know. Trudeau and Trump were joking about their trade disagreements. And Donald Trump even suggested, when asked, he thought there would be a joint statement. So if that means a consensus communique, well, the Charlevoix summit is really headed for success.
Point is, John, you say there were smiles and there was even jokes about trade issues between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump, but these are very real tariffs that are going to be imposed on Canadian goods. How did they resolve that?
Well, at a minimum, they're kicking the can down the road and not letting that disagreement infect anything else, but also, of course, not coming up with an instant solution because Donald Trump is not particularly aware of the intricacies of the supply chain on trade or aluminum or other things. And he already has on his mind the big summit he's going to afterwards in Singapore to make history with the North Koreans, and all G7 leaders are behind him. That is a great unifying force. It's what they're talking about right now when they're alone together for their dinner, focusing on peace and security with North Korea front and center there.
Right, that's an important point you make there. Of course, there's that big summit coming up, Donald Trump and the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which takes place in Singapore. That's next week. And let me bring in Dan Perkins here from Florida. Dan, looking at that summit that's coming up, I mean, was Donald Trump really invested in this G7 summit, or is his mind somewhere else, perhaps in Singapore?
Thank you for having me on. Yes, he's very much invested in both summits. The trade issue is a major campaign benchmark for Donald Trump. Let me give you a quick example. If American dairy farmers want to export dairy product to Canada, the tariff that the Canadian government imposes is 230% of the price of the goods. The English, which are coming towards Mr. Trump, if an English car manufacturer wants to export his car across the channel to mainstream Europe, the European Union charges him a 10% royalty. But if Volkswagen wants to move its car on the other direction, going towards the United Kingdom only charges approximately 2%. So that the tariff from bringing that car from the UK into mainland Europe is 5 times the tariff of what the UK charges. What Mr. Trump has been saying all along, that these trade deals were made at a time when America was benevolent and didn't really care. And because of those trade deals, many jobs and manufacturing facilities left the United States. China, for example, before it became a member of the World Trade Organization, accounted for 13% of the world's steel.
Right.
Now it's 43%. And so what Mr. Trump is saying very firmly is that many of the trade deals and the tariff imposed by foreign nations is unfair against the United States.
And from what you're saying there, Dan, these tariffs that Mr. Trump is going to be imposing, is that going to make it fair? Is that going to increase trade between the United States and its main partners?
I think what most of the people that, if you look at the dollar amounts of the tariffs that are being imposed on the dollar amount of trade, yeah, it's not a huge percentage of the overall trade of what happens.
Okay.
So I think what it's doing is it's going to bring people to the table to say, wait a minute, maybe these tariffs need to be renegotiated.
Okay. Let's go to Remy Pierre in Miami. And Remy Pierre, something that a lot of people have been talking about even before the summit started was a comment that President Trump made, said that he would like to see Russia, which was expelled from the G8 at the time, it became the G7. He'd like to see Russia reinstated into this group of industrialized nations. Let's listen to what President Trump said.
Russia should be in this meeting. Why are we having a meeting without Russia being in the meeting? And I would recommend, and it's up to them, but Russia should be in the meeting. It should be a part of it. You know, whether you like it or not, and it may not be politically correct, but we have a world to run.
So, Remy, listening there to what the president had to say, he makes the point, look, this might not be politically correct. There may be a lot of people who will be very upset at hearing me say that Russia should be back in the G7. But he says, we have a world to run.
Well, I'll address Russia just right now, but just a small thing on trade issues. I think it would be terribly naive to believe that all the countries get along very well because they smile on camera. And there's going to be a real war on trade issues with the European Union actually raising tariffs on a series of products from peanut butter to motorcycle to bourbon and whiskey, which are produced in very important politically important states in the U.S. for the upcoming elections. So there's going to be a retaliation from the European Union on these issues. And the fact that, you know, having tariffs and renegotiating tariffs on steel and aluminum is going to be creating some jobs in the U.S., that's a very short-sighted view. It will create jobs in the steel and aluminum industry, but it's actually going to be destroying a series of jobs in the manufacturing sectors because they're going to be importing steel at a higher cost, and they're not going to be competitive for manufacturing cars or other products of much higher value for the American economy. Now, in the specific case of Russia, it's actually a very smart move from Trump at first. His idea here was to try to break up this alliance of countries in front of him in Canada. He actually surprised his administration because it was not on the agenda. His idea was to try to pull Italy out of the concert of nations in front of the U.S. because Italy has always had a more keen and more open vision towards Russia for a series of issues such as energy or military cooperation. At first, Antonio Conte, which is the new not president, sorry, but prime minister of Italy, started saying it was a good idea and got called back by Macron, Merkel, and Trudeau, and now there's a joint position against Russia just joining again the G7. So that was a try to just break down the coalition from the US, but that fell flat.
Brian, we've often heard the G7 being described as a very elite club. And, you know, President Trump set off this debate about Russia coming back into this club. Point is, are the Russians interested in coming back?
I don't think so. Putin was pretty nonchalant about being evicted. The fact is the G7 should be dissolved. I mean, the G7 is an obsolete entity. It's the former imperial colonial powers getting together without Africa and getting together without Asia, with the exception of Japan. Certainly getting out without the Middle East or Brazil and the big countries in Latin America. It's a hangover of the 19th century, in fact. It should be understood to be fundamentally irrelevant. But nonetheless, the United States at the end of World War II created a new world order, partly to end the scourge of war between these empires, between these colonial entities, whereby the United States rehabilitated its defeated enemies, Germany and Japan, and revived its allies who had been defeated and brought them together in what's called a rules-based international order, whereby the United States led this world order, and in return, the other countries got access to markets, including the U.S. market. Now that post-World War II world order is being undone by who? By the President of the United States, and it's taken these other countries, especially the European countries, by surprise. But nonetheless, it's a reflection, I think, of the fact that that old post-World War II world order, like all world orders, does eventually fray, does eventually come apart. We see Donald Trump being the catalyst for it, which in some ways is a great irony in history, but in fact, that's what we're witnessing.
What do you make of that, John, the fact that the G7 has become irrelevant?
Not at all. Look, the Soviet Union was dissolved because it lost the Cold War. It was the G7 that won the Cold War. It doesn't need to be dissolved. It was created to protect within its own members and to promote globally the values of open democracy, individual liberty, and social advance. It's come a long way since the dark days of 1975 when it started, but there's still a lot more work to do. And if that involves finding a way to resume the G7 discussion with Russia, well, yes, the G7's been trying to do that ever since Russia was suspended for its aggression and annexation in Ukraine, the Normandy format. So when Donald Trump says maybe we should think about bringing them to a meeting so we could negotiate with them face to face, well, maybe the time will soon come to give that dialogue a chance. After all, if he can do it with Kim Jong-il of North Korea, why shouldn't we all do it with our former partner and the next door neighbor for Canada and the United States, Vladimir Putin, sometime soon?
John, I just want to get back to the trade issue. And, you know, we heard a lot from other leaders about what the United States was doing. We heard, as I pointed out earlier on, those very tough comments made by the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And I'm wondering how all that all of a sudden dissipated at this meeting. And as you point out, there was friendliness at the meeting because just before this meeting started, the President's economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, had this to say about those tariffs. Let's watch.
President Trump is very clear with respect to his trade reform efforts that we will do what is necessary to protect the United States, its businesses, and its workforce, so that we may have disagreements, we may have tactical disagreements, but he has always said, and I agree, tariffs are a tool in that effort. And people should recognize how serious he is in that respect.
So, John, here we heard Larry Kudlow tell us there that the United States is going to protect its industries, its workforce. Doesn't sound much in the way of compromise there. Do the other sides go with that?
Well, that was just a very small part of Larry's statement yesterday of President Trump's goals for this summit. One, economic growth. That's the one Justin Trudeau, the host, had put in first place, too. Peace and security, Justin's got it there. His bilateral agreements with Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron, that's really good news. And yes, trade was there. But the interesting thing about what Larry said about trade is that Donald Trump believes in free trade, believes in the multilateral trade system, but it needs to be fixed because it's gone wrong. And that means fair trade, reciprocity. But he quickly turned the attention not to some small tariffs from one G7 member to the other, but to the unfair practices of China, theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfer, and all of the G7 countries share that view and are united in saying China has got to do better if the multilateral trade and investment system is going to work now and in the future years. And the solution inside the G7 is an obvious one. Let's have zero tariffs on all products that those countries trade with one another.
Right.
Only one country does at present. That is an initiative worthy of President Trump.
Remy Pierre, what do you make of what you just heard there? It sounds perfectly reasonable from what John is telling us that Donald Trump has a point.
Well, there's actually an organization to deal on those trade issues. It's called the World Trade Organization. That's where all the countries get together and discuss issues of, let's say, competition that is unfair from China on intellectual property, or deals with issues of tariffs on specific issues such as using MGOs or using different types of production for farming products and so on, that explain some of the tariffs that European Union has placed on the United States. The very status of this organization, of which the United States, all G7 members and most countries are members, says that unilaterally raising tariffs on aluminum or steels or whichever product is actually illegal. And that's why the European Union countries have actually presented a contestation of this measure. Now, going back to the essential point, what do we want here? We want to protect jobs, whether it's in the US, in European, in different countries. We also want to make sure that different companies are competitive. By increasing the prices of their imports, that's not how you're going to make the car industry or the aircraft industry in the US competitive. And you're going to be seeing the loss of jobs in the long run, maybe not in the short run, in the next 2 or 3 years, but the companies that actually are not benefiting from cheap import of products from countries that might be better at producing them will suffer down the road, and you're going to have a lots of different jobs in high-level companies in the US in 4 to 5 years.
Dan, what do you make of that? That goods will get more expensive in South Africa because it'll be the American consumer that's ultimately going to pay for this.
I think there's a flaw in the argument because it makes the assumption that it's going to be this way for the next 4 to 5 years, as one of your other guests pointed out. I don't think it's going to take 4 to 5 years for the world to begin to understand the importance, as one of your other guests said, open and free trade with no tariffs. I think there's a natural fear because they have operated under protective tariffs for a number of decades that something's going to happen. But I don't think that this is going to be 3 to 5 years worth of tariffs. I think it's a tool, as Larry Kudlow said, that helps the president send the message to the various nations. We need to come to the table and talk about how we're going to create free and fair trade. And I think that will happen. The importance of the United States as a trading partner for the other 6 nations is very, very important.
All right. Brian, I've heard this from other people at the White House as well, telling us that what we're hearing from President Trump is not really policy that he wants to implement. It's a negotiating tactic.
Possibly, but let's also put this into a political perspective and sort of a big picture perspective. We've had an economic expansion that's gone on since 2008. That's 10 years old now. It's about to end. It will end sometime in the next year or 2 or 3 years. At that time, there's going to be a venomous rivalry about who's going to share or have the burden placed on their shoulders for what will be economic contraction. By unleashing the tendencies towards this kind of nationalist populism here in the United States and with right-wing parties in Europe, this tendency will accelerate. So if there's a sort of a modicum of stability right now between the G7 countries, that will, and it's not that stable because Donald Trump is actually pushing the envelope, creating contradictions, creating adversity. They feel it sharply. Public opinion in Europe is turning very strongly against not just Donald Trump, but against the United States for these bullying tactics. Those tendencies will accelerate at the first instance of economic contraction that makes more unemployment in the United States and in European countries and in Asia. So I think this is a very dangerous sort of political set of circumstances that's being constructed by the America First nationalism. Again, Donald Trump is pretending that America is just this helpless giant and everyone else has hurt America. That's a bad message.
When you talk about an economic contraction, Brian, what would precipitate that?
Well, we have just the global business cycle. I mean, we have a boom-bust cycle. I mean, every 8 or 10 or 12 years, there's an economic recession. More is produced than can be sold at a profit. All of the countries and all of the companies are all producing equally. Suddenly, they cancel their products. Suddenly, they have to start to lay off. The ripple effect, as we saw in 2007, 2008, it had a profound dynamism. Yeah. But even if it's not that dynamic, it impacts all countries.
Okay. John, if we can look at President Trump, and if we sort of try to understand what motivated him to impose these tariffs, to make these announcements, I want to talk about the manner in which he did it when he announced it last week. I mean, he invoked national security in the United States, and it's something that particularly angered the Canadian Prime Minister, who said that Canada has never posed a threat to the United States, has never been hostile to the United States. Why do you think he invoked national security?
Well, because it was the only rule of the WTO on the face of it that he could use to justify what he did. So in a strange way, it kind of showed that he still believes in the rule of law, the trade type, and even the WTO. Now, the Canadians were right to be outraged. I mean, we fought for the United States in 1914 and 1939 before Pearl Harbor showed up, NORAD, the Korean War, on and on and on. But I see hope in the particular phrase that Larry Kudlow used on priority number 4. It wasn't national security, it was shared security, and he clearly meant of the G7 as a whole in the face of external threats, North Korea being the first one. So I think we may have reached the peak. Donald Trump, I think, could easily understand the old instrument of tariffs on the old economy sectors of steel, aluminum, but really, in the economy of the United States, we're playing for the future. Right. Automotives, cars are computers on wheels, the digital economy. So I think we'll face those challenges here in Charlevoix with a common cause.
Remy, we hear there that President Trump wants to play by the rules, so he realizes that he cannot impose these tariffs without invoking national security because he's able to skirt that rule and go around it. So is he really playing by the rules?
Well, he's using the rules the way he can use them. But the idea here is to try to look at the big picture also. Each of those leaders have domestic challenges, have facing their own potential elections down the road. They have discontentment from the population when they're looking at the actions taken by Donald Trump. Macron has tried to be very friendly with Donald Trump to try to change his views on the series of topics from the Paris Accord on climate change to Iran negotiations. And despite trying to be as friendly as possible, nothing has changed on the Trump administration. So that was kind of naive perspective from Macron, and he's been facing very harsh criticism in France. Same thing, Trudeau is having a very strong focus from his domestic basis on being able to retaliate or having people very much threatened or offended by the allusion to the 1812 war that Canada is a security threat to the U.S. So, I mean, all those governmental leaders have to answer to their population also, and their population are very now antagonistic to the U.S. because they understand that Donald Trump is not playing a fair game of finding a real concerted negotiation of decreasing tariffs, and it's not by raising tariffs that you encourage people to decrease tariffs. That just doesn't work this way.
Dan, very quickly, I've got a minute left. What do you expect will come out of this summit?
I think they'll shake hands. President's already announced he's leaving before the discussion about climate change. But from a practical standpoint, he said everything he wanted to say already. He'll probably say some things at dinner and some things in the morning. But his focus is now squarely on Mr. Kim on Wednesday.
Speaking about that, Brian, you head off to Singapore to cover that meeting. Do you think it came up for discussion at this G7?
Oh, it has to. I mean, it is really still the big issue in the world. Of course, trade comes right after it, but the issue of war and peace on the Korean Peninsula, the possibility of a historic breakthrough on the Korean Peninsula, that has to be uppermost for all of these countries, certainly for Japan, but all of the NATO countries as well.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.